Hello everyone, welcome to part B of the Drydock episode 241, and well, you know why you're here, let's continue with the Patreon questions for this month. Andre Decoux asks, how did they measure in practice the amount of power, i.e. shaft horsepower, that a ship's engine produces? So you will find a wide variety of ways of calculating shaft horsepower that are mentioned in different places. However, from a publication, Principles of Engineering, which is of the period that the channel covers, I think that's probably one of the best places to go. And bear in mind there is a difference between indicated horsepower, shaft horsepower, nominal horsepower, effective horsepower, etc., etc. But for shaft horsepower, the equation is 2 pi nt, that's 2 pi November Tango, over 33,000. Now, that formula is based on, well, 2, fairly obvious, pi, fairly obvious, we all know that from 2 pi r squared, all those wonderful things you learn in secondary school. N is the RPM, i.e. how many revolutions per minute is this shaft undertaking, and T is a value for torque, or torsion, which you measure using a torsion meter. So you would put the torsion meter on the propeller shaft as it goes round, and then that'll give you a value. Now, the reason for the divide by 33,000 is because in this particular instance, the torque is measured in foot-pounds. If your torsion meter is measuring in some other unit, then, of course, the divide-through number will be different. But so effectively, it's 2 multiplied by pi multiplied by the RPM multiplied by the torque divided through by whichever constant corresponds to your torque measurement unit. And that will give you your actual shaft horsepower. So you might calculate your shaft horsepower, but if you, as Andre asks, if you want to actually work out what it is at the point of use, you'd have to go down into one of the shaft alleys, attach your torsion meter, take your reading, and then run your calculation. Joel Mullen asks, why did the Austro-Hungarian Navy not pursue a more aggressive strategy in the Great War? For example, it seems to me there was an excellent chance to attack the British and French rear in the Dardanelles. Granted, they'd have needed to sneak past the Italians to corner the Allies in the Straits, but the opportunity was there, it would seem. Or, failing that, more aggressive moves against the Italian Navy to force a major action? Well, the Austro-Hungarian Navy did undertake a series of fairly major offensive actions against the Italians. I've got a whole video on the Ancona bombardment and the surrounding operations, for example. The problem that they had was that the on-paper strength of the Austro-Hungarian Navy and the Italian Navy was fairly close. It would alter, basically, depending on who'd commissioned their latest dreadnought and various other ships. But the problem was it was never quite wide enough to commit to just sitting your entire battle fleet off the enemy coast where they had submarines, torpedo boats, etc., and waiting for the other guy to come out. And given how closely matched they were in numbers, there was a very, very dice roll probability of who's going to come out the winner. Which, again, it made both sides theoretically willing to accept a fleet action, but only on very specific terms, which in turn means that both sides are being very cagey about it. Plus, of course, for the first few months of World War I, they're theoretically on the same side, so they can't attack the Italians at that point, and once the Italians are in the war, they have British and French units to back them up, which will basically tip the balance of power in favour of the Italians in a fleet engagement. As for why they don't go after the British and French in the Dardanelles, well, whilst the initial British and French operations in the Dardanelles are before Italy formally joins the Allies, relations with Italy are deteriorating, and if the Austro-Hungarian fleet leaves, then they're leaving their home turf open up to the Italians, and bearing in mind that Italy and Austria-Hungary are not really part of a triple alliance with Germany. They are allied separately with Germany. On paper, they're all allies together, but realistically, Austria-Hungary and Italy would be at each other's throats, save for the fact they've had a mutual ally in Germany. So the Austro-Hungarian fleet is not going to leave a significant portion of its fleet to go off to the Dardanelles and then leave the coast exposed to the Italians, who they really, really don't like and really, really don't trust. Plus, if you do, for whatever reason, decide that you're going to do this, the Allied fleet that's collected at the Dardanelles is not the entirety of the Allied fleet that's present in the Mediterranean. The French Navy is active in fairly large numbers in the Western Mediterranean. The Royal Navy does have other units in the Mediterranean, and so if you do head that way, there is every chance that the British and French will rally further forces to either intercept you or to then catch you in a pincer movement. Because even if all of the Austro-Hungarian Navy's capital ships, so armoured cruisers, pre-dreadnoughts and dreadnoughts, sail against, say, the force that the British and French have put together for the initial big naval attack that occurs early in 1915, it's questionable who's going to win, because whilst the Austro-Hungarian forces would have more dreadnoughts, the one they'd be facing off against is Queen Elizabeth, and the British and French fleet would have more pre-dreadnoughts. And as I said, that's before the French maybe bring in some of their ships from the west, and the British bring in other ships that are around the Mediterranean anyway. So it's just not worth it. The Austro-Hungarian fleet, even if they somehow theoretically pulled off a complete sneak attack, as much as you can pull off a sneak attack by sailing all the way down the Adriatic, across the Mediterranean and back up into the Aegean, without anybody noticing. But if you somehow manage to do that, your forces are going to be massively, massively weakened, and then you've got to get back through a now alerted Mediterranean. And if you think the Italians aren't going to take advantage of that, oh boy, you've got another thing coming, and they knew that. Rodney McCoy asks, did the Kriegsmarine ever wargame fleet problems similar to the US Navy prior to the start of the Polish conflict? In particular, was there ever any attempt to use the 3 Deutschlands and 2 Scharnhorsts in any coordinated manner during those early months of the war? And was there ever any attempt to try and hunt as a group? Although they did have exercises, there's nothing on the scale of a US Navy fleet problem, either in terms of absolute scale, because of course the Kriegsmarine doesn't have anywhere near that number of ships, or in terms of proportional scale, because the Kriegsmarine wasn't planning for a major fleet action of any particular description, because they knew they wouldn't win such an engagement. Using the 3 Deutschlands and the 2 Scharnhorst together is not a non-starter as far as the Germans are concerned, because, well, there's one, actually having all 5 ships operational at one time is a little bit of an ask, but B, even if they were, well, the Deutschlands are speed limited compared to the Scharnhorsts, so you are basically either giving the Deutschlands a really overpowered escort, or you're very badly hobbling the Scharnhorst operational capabilities. Plus, you've got to find the fuel to run 5 of these ships all at once. Plus, the chances of detection go up, and also the priority of targeting goes up, because if you put a single Deutschland out into the ocean, like, say, with Graf Spee, it can operate on its own. It only requires a certain amount of fuel, which it may be able to get its hands on to sustain its fleet operations. And bear in mind, you've also got German resupply ships. They've got limited amounts of stock aboard. And because of the nature of the threat, the British might, in your nightmare scenario, go after it with something like, oh, I don't know, Renown and Ark Royal. But they're much more likely to try hunting you down with cruiser groups, which you may or may not be able to handle. If you send out your entire capital ship strength, then, well, one, if you lose it all, that's it, you have no more capital ships, which is going to be something of a problem. But two, you're pretty much guaranteed to lose all your capital ships, because if you send out a force that large, then there's only a limited number of places it can be. You're going to be extremely hard-pressed to keep them all at sea at once, from this operating from the same supply lines, so their voyage is going to be relatively short and constrained. And, well, if you're going to give your opponent such a golden opportunity on a platter, you can guarantee the British will concentrate every single ship they can possibly find to hunt you down. And in the opening stages of the war, the Marine Nationale is going to get in on the act as well. So you might have, say, a hunting group of 3 Deutschlands and 2 Scharnhorsts, and then once the Anglo-French forces have worked out where you are, then come steaming over the horizon, you might have Hood, Renown, Repulse, Dunkirk, Strasbourg, and about a dozen heavy cruisers of various descriptions, all eager for your blood, and you're not going to win that fight. And the Deutschlands can't even hope to get away, let alone... I mean, the Scharnhorst probably can't get away, but the Deutschlands definitely can't. The closest you come to a group pack hunting effort by the Germans is probably Operation Berlin, where the two Scharnhorsts go out together. King Brock asks, would a submarine-delivered nuke be a viable alternative to the B-29? Given Japanese lack of anti-submarine warfare, could a submarine have snuck into Tokyo Harbour with a nuke, placed it with a timer, and then left? Not really, for a number of reasons. Firstly, Japan is lacking in anti-submarine warfare compared to the Allies. She's not completely lacking, though, and a submarine trying to sneak into Tokyo Harbour runs a relatively high risk of being detected, which is not really an acceptable option if you are carrying something as valuable as one of your country's very, very few nukes. Another problem is going to be how exactly you're going to deliver it, because even if you go with the slightly narrower diameter one, the little boy bomb, that is not small enough to fit into a torpedo tube. Fat Man definitely isn't going to get in a torpedo tube. And they weigh about 4.5 tons apiece, which means that even mine-laying subs are going to struggle, because whilst you could, in theory, substitute a naval mine in some mine-laying subs for one of the early nukes based on size, it's certainly going to be a bit of a problem with the weight of the blasted thing. And obviously a mine-laying sub is going to be considerably larger than your average sub, less agile, more prone to detection, and there's not that many of them. Now, the only thing that in theory has the weight carrying capacity and stealth to get into Tokyo Harbour to lay some kind of nuclear device would ironically enough be a British X-craft, because they have these saddle charges which actually weight-wise are slightly heavier than an atomic bomb, and therefore you could in theory strap some kind of reshelled atomic bomb to the side of an X-craft and have that sneak in and drop its nuke and get away. And obviously being a much smaller craft, it's going to have an easier job sneaking in, navigating through shallow water, placing its charge and escaping. But given the various issues that various X-craft run into, both in waters of Norway, going after Tirpitz, and in their various Pacific Fleet operations, it's not anywhere close to being as guaranteed a drop as the B-29 would be. And it would have to also be on a fairly long timer, because then, in theory, your X-craft has to get back out to the mother sub, which has dropped it off, which, of course, may itself be intercepted on the way in whilst waiting or on its way out. So, overall, it's a much, much higher risk strategy. It could, in theory, be done, but it would be much, much more risky than the B-29 drop. Plus, at this stage, they don't know what effects detonating a nuke underwater is going to have. That all comes with Operation Crossroads. All they've worked out at this point in the Trinity tests is surface versus airburst detonation. Tweezenflute asks, Norman Friedman, in Fighting the Great War at Sea on page 42, says about HMS Erin, late war features included searchlights concentrated around her aft funnel, so that it would be difficult to estimate her course at night. Please explain. This is thanks to some fairly simple observations that were made during early attempts at night fighting. The logical thing you would imagine would be to position your searchlights all around the ship, because it means you can highlight a target in any given direction, and if enemy return fire lands near your searchlights and knocks one of them out, if they're scattered all around the ship, then surely the logic would suggest that the others will continue to function. So this is a good thing. Unfortunately, what it means is that if you light off searchlights all along the length of the ship, it gives the enemy a very good point of reference, or multiple points of reference, in fact, which then allows you to estimate the course and speed of the people who are using the searchlights. Apart from anything, the searchlights will obviously, in theory, illuminate a small portion of the ship, so a searchlight, say, on the bridge might cast some light and illuminate the top of the turret, so if you see bridge structure and turrets. Right, that's the fore end of the ship. Oh, there's a searchlight back there. You just see turrets, and they're on a lower level. Right, so that's obviously the aft bit of the ship. So you've now worked out direction. And then you can also use the relative position of the searchlights to work out course. Whereas if you have all the searchlights concentrated in one area, particularly roughly a midships area, then you're not giving them a huge amount of information from backscatter as to what part of the ship's actually being illuminated. If the ship changes course, then the searchlights are either at the point of rotation or close to it, so you're not going to see a huge swing in their position, which might indicate which direction the ship's going. And because they're all in one place, you can't get relative bearings off of them. So if you had a searchlight on the bridge tower and a searchlight on one of the aft turrets, and the ship was at, say, 45 degrees towards you, you could see, this searchlight is closer to me, that searchlight is further away from me, draw a line between the two, this is the bearing that the enemy ship is on. Whereas if they're all at one point, it's like, well, there's a point source of glary light. This tells me nothing about what direction or whatever that the ship is doing, which obviously serves you fairly well in combat. It also means that if the enemy choose to shoot back at you, this is a much more tertiary issue, to be honest, but if they do choose to shoot back at you and they land somewhere in the vicinity of the searchlights on a ship like Erin, that means 4/5 of the main armament is not going to be under fire. So that's good. Edward Hopkins asks, I'm curious about the method of access, stairs, ladders, etc., to the platforms on top of World War I and World War II battleship masts, and the most senior rank or age of someone who is likely to be assigned to that position. Would an admiral or a captain ever get up there? The method of access could vary quite considerably depending on how substantial the structure that the top was mounted on was. So if you've got a particularly high resolution or large screen, or you can zoom on your phone, you can see in this picture of HMS Canada that the central shaft of the tripod mast there actually has a ladder running up the side of it. Some masts were massive enough that the ladder was inside of the mast tube instead of on the exterior, but basically you're climbing a ladder in some way, shape or form. As far as the most senior rank or age of someone who's likely to be assigned to that position, as in a duty assignment, you are probably looking at somebody with the rank of lieutenant commander or lieutenant commander, maybe a commander as well. So you're probably talking about up to probably mid-30s would be probably about the oldest you'd expect to find regularly assigned. Although, again, it does depend on what era you're looking at, because the importance and type of equipment that's up there will vary hugely. So if you're talking about an era where this is the ship's primary rangefinder, or possibly only rangefinder, or primary fighting top, you might find a fairly senior officer up there. Whereas if you're talking about, say, mid-World War II, where there might be 4 identical rangefinders of different values scattered around the place, and there's some radar involved as well, then you might only find a lieutenant or lieutenant or similar rank stuck up there, at which point obviously their age is going to be a little bit younger. Would an admiral or captain ever get up there? They could do if they wanted. There are certainly plenty of records of captains coming up to fighting tops for inspections, but they obviously wouldn't be typically assigned up there. Brian Stevens asks, the Arsenal of Venice has been credited as a significant factor for the West winning against the East in the Mediterranean. Are there any other similar shipbuilding centres in history with similar impacts in the ancient and classical worlds? Well, there are certainly major shipbuilding centres in the ancient and classical world that had significant impacts on history. They didn't necessarily mean that their builders or were going to win a war, but certainly things could rotate around them. So obviously there's the great port of Carthage, as seen here in this artist's depiction, which you can just about see what's left of it even these days. So home base of the Carthaginian navy, obviously fairly significant in both the First and Second Punic Wars, although Carthage didn't end up winning those. Then you've got places like Tyre, which is initially Phoenician and, well, still is Phoenician, but very much its own independent thing later on. Very renowned shipbuilding centre and sort of a linchpin of trade and military activity, although it did have a distressing habit of falling to sieges when somebody really got organised and annoyed with it. And of course the Athenians, with Piraeus, they built a ton of triremes there, which helped them both to join with Greek city-states to fend off incoming Persian attacks, and then also to have wars with other fellow Greek city-states. So there are a variety of notable shipbuilding centres. As I said, didn't necessarily mean their owners would win the war, but they were very notable and very, very sought after, and there's plenty of others besides. But those are some that immediately come to mind. Whether or not they're exactly as important as the Arsenal of Venice is very much subject to historian interpretation. Riva asks, whilst I appreciate the project GUPPY itself is outside of the scope of the channel, it does leave me wondering about what technical limitations prevented such designs happening earlier. Was it design inertia, technological innovations, changing threats, etc. that led to submarines becoming submerged first, ocean-going vessels? How early could such a vessel have been developed if someone had put their mind to it and or had that bright idea? And what limits the design coming around even sooner? Well, as I've covered in a previous 5-minute guide video, technically, submerged first, underwater speed as a priority submarines were developed in the First World War with the advent of the R-class, which are also technically the world's first hunter-killer subs, specifically designed to hunt down and kill other submarines. However, in terms of what prevents this becoming the norm, there's quite a number of issues. Firstly is seakeeping, because at the kind of long-range missions that something like a Blowout, Tench, T-class, etc., or even a Type 7 or Type 9 are supposed to undertake, they're going to be spending the majority of their time on the surface because battery technology just doesn't exist that is compact enough and powerful enough to allow them to spend the vast majority of their time underwater. So part of what makes the GUPPY class program possible is the advances in both reducing the size and increasing the power density of batteries. The R-class kind of got around this by being very, very small and having a frankly insane number of batteries for its size, but that did result in, relatively speaking, short operational ranges. And if you, therefore, due to technology, are going to have to spend a majority of your time on the surface, that means that your outer hull casing has to be shaped in such a way as to provide you with the best stability and speed on the surface, which is very different from what your external hull form needs to be to ensure the best speed and stability whilst you're underwater. So that brings your submerged speed down, which also further mitigates against you being a primarily submerged vessel. You've also got the development of sonar in a submarine-capable form. Obviously, passive, hydrophones, and active. All of these things are really developed and then miniaturized to a point you can fit them on a sub during the Second World War. Without them, your ability to detect and engage targets whilst submerged is relatively minimal. The only people who really had a doctrine of fully submerged engagement of surface ships, i.e. we're not talking about periscope depth, we're talking about 40, 50, whatever, 100 foot down, was the US, and they very rapidly found that even relying on very early World War I hydrophones, etc., plus torpedo computers to try and target a ship on the surface, it didn't tend to work particularly brilliantly. And, well, you could go on, all sorts of other things involved, but generally it is the engine technology, particularly the battery technology, and how do you engage whilst remaining underwater, that are the two big problems that tend to be solved by developments in the Second World War, which can then be refined into newer lessons, which can then be applied to newer subs and then retrofitted to a certain extent onto things like the GUPPYs or the refitted T-class in the Royal Navy, and so on and so forth. Jason Lambert asks, I live in Idaho and was wondering if you have heard of or had any information about the former naval ordnance plant located at Pocatello, I think that's how it's pronounced, Idaho. The plant was constructed during World War II and is still there today, and I've always been curious about its history. I know very little about the history of the plant, but I've read somewhere that South Dakota's damaged 16-inch gun was sent there for testing. So once the US looked like it was going to get involved in World War II, and then with Pearl Harbor did actually get involved, they were faced with something of a problem. They knew that they were going to have more battleships in service than they thought they were going to, because they were obviously going to keep any existing ones in service whilst building more rather than scrapping the old ones as new ones came in. Plus wartime production, they might well end up building more than they'd originally planned. This meant a lot of naval guns were going to be around, so they needed more facilities to build, reline, refit and test naval guns and their associated mountings. And so they had to construct a bunch of additional factories, one of which was this one, Naval Ordnance Plant Pocatello, which is in Idaho, which, as most people who can read a map will be able to tell, is a fair distance from the sea. Now, sometimes justification is given by saying that, oh, well, the Navy wanted to make sure that the new factories were well outside of range of naval bombardment. Well, I think kind of putting it in the Midwestern United States is probably a bit of overkill on that. You know, anything beyond about 40 miles from the coast would have been fine. But never mind, it's definitely outside of naval bombardment range. But it is close to at least what at the time were a number of major transport intersections, road, rail, etc., etc. So stuff could be shipped to and from it relatively easily. And that was essentially its purpose. It served during the second part of World War II. They started construction in 1942, and it was up and running, at least the first buildings were, by mid-1943. But then post-war, it gradually wound down until it was decommissioned in the 1950s because, well, one, it was relative peacetime, so there's not quite the same level of usage on naval guns. Two, the era of the battleship was held to be passing, so even with the modern battleships, there were fewer of them in service, even though a bunch of them were at that point still in mothballs. And there were a lot of naval ordnance plants, so they had to slim down a bit. For example, if you look at the US Navy Department's appropriation bill for 1947, so 2 years after the end of World War II, there's the naval gun factory, the naval powder factory, and then under naval ordnance plants, they list quite a few. There's the Pocatello plant, there's one in South Charleston, one in Baldwin, one in Centerline, Louisville, Milledgeville, York, Macon, Canton, Indianapolis, and Dresden. And that's Dresden in the US, not Dresden in Germany. And even at this point, they're talking about getting rid of some of them. For example, immediately under that table, it mentions the first two paragraphs. The ordnance plant at Pocatello, Idaho, is concerned basically with relining guns and also with the stowage of spare gun mounts and spare ordnance equipment. The ordnance plant at South Charleston will be entirely engaged in a stowage function and a standby plant for the manufacture of armour and guns. The naval ordnance plant at Baldwin, New York, has been declared surplus and turned over to the Bureau of Yards and Docks. So, even 2 years later, they're getting rid of them. So that's a brief potted history of why it was built and when it was operational as an actual naval ordnance plant, although, as you know, the building is still there and has been used for a variety of different things ever since. Logan W. asks, after watching blowout panels on main battle tanks, I got curious to see if warships ever employed anything similar in the event of a magazine explosion. Essentially, no. There are no such things as blowout panels on battleships, for a number of good reasons. Firstly, just the sheer amount of explosive involved. If your main magazine detonates, no amount of blowout paneling is going to actually save you, in part just through the sheer amount of explosive involved, and also due to the density in which it's packed relative to how ammunition is stored in a tank turret. Plus, as you can see here from this King George V armour scheme, where would the panelling go? Because if you put it in such a way that it projects the explosion even partially above the waterline, you will create a hole in the armour protection that's meant to stop the shells getting into the magazine and penetrating and causing it to explode. And if you're going to have even the slightest chance of venting any substantial amount of expanding gas from something the size of a battleship's main magazine cooking off, you're going to need a very, very large passageway, at which point you basically are making that section of the ship unarmoured. And you can't really vent it into the sea because, well, as you can see, again, If you vent it into the sea on the lower part of the armour plate, well, the armour plate's there for a reason. If you vent it lower than that, you're going to be going through the torpedo defence system, thus creating a weak spot there, making it more likely for the ship to either be sunk or blown up by a torpedo strike. The only other place you can do it would be to have some kind of blowout panel system going through the ship's double or triple bottom, which again compromises the ship's safety in terms of, the access of water into the vessel, and the magazine's a fairly large volume internally, and water is fairly resistant to explosions anyway, so it's not really going to vent much, if at all. So basically there isn't anywhere that is safe and or reasonable to vent a magazine explosion, and even if you could find somewhere to do so, magically the amount of space that you'd need to take up with the passageway is going to basically absorb too much of the ship's structure, and, well, that's probably still not going to vent anywhere close to enough expanding hot gas to stop your ship being broken in two. Wayland Chow asks, if you were in charge of designing the Iowa-class battleships, what changes would you have made? Well, that's a dangerous question, because, as you know, I love the all-forward gun layout. And, I mean, it saves weight on armour. It allows you to, theoretically, if you want the same citadel, supposed to have more engines, and after all, what is the Iowa supposed to be but a hard-charging, high-speed attack ship? At which point, if you left me unsupervised with the Iowa-class plans, you'd probably end up with something like this. It's not exactly 100% what I would do, but that's because I can't put a secondary structure at the back in Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts, so I've had to approximate using barbettes. But what you're seeing here would be my version. It's kind of an American Richelieu, sort of, but as you can see up front, you have two quad 16-inch 50 caliber turrets, and kind of taking the work that had been done for the quad 14s on the original North Carolina variant. You've then got your standard 5 twin 5-inch 38s either side of the superstructure, and then in this particular form, using a series of barbettes, you have another 4 5-inch 38 mounts running spinally down the back. In reality, I'd probably do some kind of central ridge mounting, a bit like the Richelieus did, but probably still have a roughly similar number of gun emplacements. So that means that your heavy anti-aircraft battery dash anti-ship secondary battery on either side now has the capability of a 9 twin mount or 18 gun broadside, which is fun. And then, of course, you smother the rest of it in further 20mm and 40mm anti-aircraft emplacements, which overall nets you a hilariously well-defended ship when it comes to air attack. You're only one gun down compared to the historical Iowa class, and you can probably even fit some bit of extra machinery in there to make you go really, really fast if you want to. Brandon Minders asks, is watertight compartmentalization useful in the age of sail? You once mentioned that the Chinese junks had one of the earliest watertight compartments despite their battle ineffectiveness. That would be the Chinese treasure ships. I would imagine that they would help somewhat in battle, and if so, why did European navies not develop them earlier, and why did Chinese junks have them? So, as I mentioned in my aside in the question, the Chinese ships that had the watertight compartmentalization were the big Chinese treasure ships of the legendary Chinese treasure fleet, so that's slightly different to the regular Chinese junks. In theory, watertight compartmentalization would have some benefit in the age of sail, but for one thing, the age of sail ships are actually rather difficult to sink. They can go ashore and get broken up on rocks and so on and so forth, and they can capsize in really bad environments. This is true. But in terms of just general sinking, when the vast majority of your ship is made up of a material that's less dense than water, i.e. wood, you actually have major problems keeping the ship down enough. So I mentioned before, when they went out to scuttle the old ship of the line Implacable after World War II, when they blew out her bottom and the ballast fell out, the rest of the ship stayed afloat. And generally, if you have major underwater hull damage to a wooden ship of the line, the ballast will fall out, and that tends to, not necessarily counteract the flooding because the water takes the place of the ballast, but the overall buoyancy doesn't change all that much. Where you do have problems is if you get water infiltration, which takes up space as well as the ballast remaining in the ship, or you get water just on the one side for whatever reason through, and then that leads to a capsize. But another issue is that wooden ships flex a lot more than iron or steel ships do, and that means that any bulkheads you put in place which have to remain watertight probably won't be watertight by the time you get into a situation where you actually need them, and instead they're just adding more weight to the ship, which is semi-pointless. Plus, if you've got these bulkheads above the water level, which obviously you probably need to, as flooding gets into the ship's going to sit low in the water slightly, then they also form splinter creation hazards if the ship gets raked end to end, and so on and so forth. So yeah, they're not really worth it in a purely wooden vessel. The reason why some of the Chinese treasure ships tend to get away with it is because of their method of construction. So if you look at the profile in cross-section of a ship of the line, a more typical vessel, compared to a very large Chinese treasure ship, there's certain construction techniques as well as the overall shape of the hull which do make the bulkheads a little bit more practicable. Plus, of course, they're long-distance ships. They're essentially one massive internal volume with a few small compartments, at which point some form of subdivision is better as compared to warships where, okay, in the age of sail, their subdivision isn't fantastic, but it's somewhat better than your average merchant. Duke Master asks, going purely on aesthetics alone, what are your favourite looking gun turrets for both main and secondary batteries? In terms of secondaries, I tend to like the 4.5-inch mount developed for the twin turrets or twin mounts for the Royal Navy in the 1930s. I tend to refer to them as the happy pancakes or the angry frying pans. There's just something really nice, simple and purposeful about them. They're almost, not quite, but almost like the old biscuit tin turrets you find on pre-dreadnoughts and some pre-dreadnoughts and mostly ironclads, but with this sort of chamfer to the upper edge, which gives it a really nice appearance, in my opinion. As far as battleship turrets go, I don't think I have a particular favourite, but I do have a particular aesthetic that I like. And I know this might come as heresy to some of you, but I don't like single angular faceplates on turrets. That's just a personal thing. I think it's partly because maybe as an engineer I appreciate how difficult an engineering feat it is to have a continuously changing curve on a large piece of metal. So I guess that appeals to me from the engineering skill standpoint. So yeah, any battleship turret where the face and the sides kind of merge together in a single surface, even as it curves around, as opposed to a very angular thing, that will appeal to me. And there's a number of different turrets built like this, mostly in World War I and the period around it, but in multiple different navies. Now, that's not to say this is the most efficient engineering layout for a turret or the most easy to produce. A simple box is far, far easier and will grant you much more internal space. I will easily grant you that, but you asked about aesthetics, not about actual efficiency. Blacksmith Panzer asks, have you considered ever doing any more videos on major events in the Great Lakes, or perhaps a more general video on the Great Lakes themselves? I mean, I could do, but with the best war in the world, the War of 1812 was probably the most exciting thing to happen in naval history terms on the Great Lakes, and I've already covered that. So, I could go into more detail about specific engagements or specific campaigns on specific lakes. But, even something like the seizure of Quebec is not actually on the Great Lakes. So, if you expand the Great Lakes to cover rivers and lakes on the Canadian-US border, then there's a little bit more to talk about. But with the War of 1812 ending with an agreement to demilitarize the Great Lakes, there's not a lot to talk about thereafter. But in some future period, sure, there's other things like the big storms there that could be discussed, but there's a lot more history to get through before I get down to that kind of nitty-gritty level. Jellicoe Cats Get Confused at Night asks, follow-up question to the response about forts guarding Portsmouth Harbour. Countries usually build fortifications when they don't have the people and or money for an army. Examples range from Norman castles in Wales to the Maginot Line. You mentioned you could get a number of ironclads for the price of a fort, but how many men would it take to man, and how much money would it take to maintain those ironclads over, say, a 10-year period, compared to the upkeep of a coastal fort? Sure, the ironclads are not much more flexible, but how much does flexibility cost? Well, it depends on a lot of different things, because, yes, the upkeep costs, if you kept, let's say, 20 ironclads running during those 10 years, would probably be higher than the upkeep cost of the fort, and there'd be higher manpower requirements, because ships have things like engines at this stage, which the forts don't. Or, well, if they have a power plant of some kind, it's not on the same scale as a ship's one. But the amount of firepower that you can bring to bear with 20 ironclads is considerably greater at any specific point than that which you can bring to bear with the local forts. So to have an equal defensive capability in terms of number of guns brought to bear at a specific site, even if you want to, say, have the same amount of guns that could be brought to bear at 3 different sites at the same time, and obviously then those can switch and rotate, or you can bring them all to bear at one point, you might not need all 20 ironclads. So you maybe only need 8 or 12, so that'll bring your costs and manpower requirements down. Plus, during times of peace, you can put some of your ships into reserve, so they have minimal manpower and upkeep requirements. Sure, the ones that are still out there will have manpower and upkeep costs, but that's reducing your budget still further. Whereas with forts, again, because of their fixed nature and also due to certain issues that you have with the construction of forts, even if they're sort of in a lower readiness state, you can't really decommission a fort without a much more extensive time needed to revive them as compared to your average ironclad. So how much does that flexibility cost? It really, really depends on what you're going to do with your fleet and how much of the fleet you're going to have. So it's unfortunately a little bit of an open-ended question, because yes, if you kept, let's say, instead of forts, you had your 20 ironclads and you kept them all in service for 10 years at full operational status, that's going to cost you a lot more to get your flexibility. But if you were, say, to operate a dozen ironclads, 8 of which are in reserve at any one point, unless tensions build up, then you recommission them for war, then your costs may come down to considerably less, and you still have a superior point defence capability. Admiralty of Floof asks, what does it look like behind the casemates? Is there individual small rooms, a large long corridor with guns every so often, a central ammunition hoist, a hoist for every gun? How do they evolve? It depends very much on the ship and the year and the navy, but initially a lot of casemate decks would be just a long gallery with guns every so often. But over time and relatively quickly, a lot of casement decks would be divided up. Now, that's not to say the bulkheads between them were particularly thick. You'd essentially be talking about maybe shrapnel proofing if you're generous. It's more to contain flash and so forth than anything else. But if you look at, say, the deck plans of USS Texas when she's originally built and shortly thereafter, you'll see that her casement deck has a series of relatively thin bulkheads dividing off each of the guns into their own individual chambers. As far as ammunition handling is concerned, again, things vary slightly. Some casement guns have ready-use ammunition lockers and not a tremendous amount else, depending on time period. Others, more commonly, you'll have a few ammunition hoists, not one per gun, and then you'll have a system of sharing the ammunition up and down the casement gallery. So that's described, for example, in some British ships at the Battle of Jutland. And sometimes you can have a hybrid of this kind of system. So if you look at, again, at USS Texas tech plans, because there's quite a few of those out there, you'll notice that the 5-inch magazines are at the, not extreme ends, but they're at the ends of the ship beyond the scope of the casement galleries themselves. But then the ammunition goes up to a deck beneath the casement guns, where it's then run along an ammunition passage, one each side, and then that will then be taken up into the individual casement guns. So that's kind of a hybrid versus the ammunition system running along at the same level as the guns. Reichspear Minister asks, can you talk about the design, thinking and implementation of the first ammunition hoist systems for the first fully traversable gun turrets on warships? How, when and where did they come about? Believe it or not, they're actually extremely early. They go along with the very first turrets, and they're extremely simple, to the point it may actually be a slightly disappointing answer. So when you look at something like, say, USS Monitor, first operational deployment of an Ericsson-style turret, the ammunition hoist system is literally, there's a hatch in the floor of the turret, there's a hatch in the ceiling underneath, and occasionally those two match up, but there's no central kind of hoist system. So if you've used up all your ready use ammunition in the turret, you have to, get ammunition from further down, and it is literally a case of align the turret with the deck and then open hatches, and someone who is one level below, who has access to a bunch more ammunition and charges, physically passes them up, and someone up above grabs them, says thank you very much, and off they go into the gun. There's a few slightly more nuanced systems that are fairly rapidly developed. So this is a Scandinavian Monitor in the latter part of the 1860s, early 1870s, and as you can see there over on the right, the magazines on this vessel are over on the side, and you have a little crane, a little fixed crane there, that lifts up the shell projectile, puts it on this little runner. That then slides into the base of the turret. This is a Coles type turret, so the base can remain static. You can see the divide there for the upper part of the gun house that's rotating. And then once that is within the turret, you can see there's a little dashed line because that is a slightly traversable secondary hoist, which again at this point is probably going to be manual. And you would then attach the shell in its little cradle to that hoist, which would then hoist up to the level of the gun. And that's why it's traversable, because then you can bring it forward to insert the ammunition into the gun, because the gun is a muzzle loader. Once you get breech loaders, of course, then you start to be able to have a more central hoist system. But the idea of magazine hoisting shell up to handling room immediately beneath the main rotating part of the gun house, and then bringing the shell up from there to the gun, that's a system that sticks around for quite a lot of the battleship era. Direct hoist from magazine to gun is a somewhat rarer implementation. And the main reason for doing it is that by the time you get to turrets, guns have gotten so large and the turret space is relatively confined that you can't store enough ammunition, both in the form of charges and in the form of projectiles, for a prolonged battle. I mean, even back in the Age of Sail, the charges, the gunpowder, was stored well deep in the ship, but run up by human beings. But you could store as many cannonballs as you liked high above, because the cannonballs were inert. But even then, ships still had magazines full of extra shot if they really, really began to burn through their ammo. Whereas with this system, you could store both your charges and your ammunition below deck, which made them slightly safer from hits, and also meant you could store considerably more of them. It was just a matter of getting the new ammunition up to the gun once it had used the ready ammunition that was stored in the gun house. Interestingly, there's a brief obviation of this system when you have particularly large turret-mounted guns which then depress down to have the ammunition rammed into them via a long rail straight from the magazine, so that doesn't require a hoist per se, but that's a bit of an aberration. Rebel Skverl asks, exactly when was the British Admiralty, i.e. the institution, not the building, established, and under what circumstances, and what impact did it have on Royal Naval operations once it was in place? Well, that's, again, one of these things that is possibly a little bit of a cause for argument, depending on how exactly you mean Admiralty. If you mean Admiralty as in the office of there being admirals, then you're looking at the very end of the 13th century. If you're looking at a single admiral in overall charge, you're looking at the end of the 14th, beginning of the 15th century. If you're looking at some kind of organisation, to organise the Navy rather than a specific individual or a couple of individuals, which is basically once the Navy's got to a size beyond it, where it's beyond the capacity of a single individual to manage, then you're looking at the mid-16th century. And if you're looking at the very specific organisation of the Board of the Admiralty, that is 1628. So, yeah. There's all sorts of potential dates that you could assign for that. I'd probably go for either the mid-16th or early 17th century dates, to be honest, because that's when you have full boards or collections of people sitting to try and organise things, as opposed to basically one guy trying to desperately run it as best as he can. And as I said, the circumstances essentially being the Navy is becoming much larger, much more formally recognised, much more established, and much more differentiated from merchant service, and it's getting larger. And as a result, not only are the ships no longer able to be kind of vaguely passed off or commissioned as commercial vessels in peacetime, but you have to now organise multiple ports, full industries to fit them out specifically as warships, and so on and so forth. So what impact did it have on Royal Navy operations? It made them a lot easier to do, because rather than having to contract with specific private dockyards to build ships, to maintain them, to find crew, etc., and it all being a little bit ad hoc, with preferred bidders and corruption and all that. I mean, there's not the corruption stopped, but once you have a full board of people, it's slightly harder to corrupt them, although not impossible. And it meant that with that came the ability to have specific royal docks, which could specialise in the construction and maintenance of warships, the storage of weaponry, and the keeping of ships in ordinary, and all that kind of thing. So it allowed the fleet to go from being essentially a small collection of warships under the monarch's personal overview that was a nice thing for him to have to project as personal power, to more of an organised semi-industrial system for the projection of the power of the state. Yokosuka Girls Marine High School training vessel Harakaze asks, you occasionally state that land battles involving armies don't concern you unless they have a direct connection to a naval engagement. That's true. How then would you classify the capture of the Dutch fleet at Den Helder? As a land event or a naval event? And can you think of any other occasion like that which took place? Well, whatever exactly happened at Den Helder, I would classify it as a naval event because, well, the ships were at sea. In the water, the fact that the water was temporarily able to be ridden across is a minor detail, comparatively speaking. As far as other occasions like this which took place, i.e. where land-based troops managed to capture or at least attack ships which were notionally not beached, there's a fair few instances that happen in rivers over the course of various time periods, because rivers obviously are much, much easier either for them to dry up or for them to temporarily dry in a certain area or for them to ice up indeed. Plus, of course, you have all sorts of assaults by ground troops into ports, which might catch ships moored up either just off of the quayside or at the quayside, at which point, the infantry can either just directly board ships or sail out in small boats. The Confederate taking of Norfolk would be an example of that, although most of the Union ships that were there were burnt before the Confederate troops could physically get to them, but they were burnt because if they weren't, then the Confederate troops would board and capture them. But in terms of ships being away from shore and then just being directly walked up to by land-based forces, that's rare, verging on unique, certainly in reliably recorded history. John Plate asks, how would a naval war between Italy and the British Empire in the 1930s go, specifically when Italy attacked Ethiopia? Well, the reason this isn't in the alternate history section is because it very nearly came to pass, and the Mediterranean fleet was in fact preparing for this. If you've seen my video on Admiral Cunningham, the part 2 section, then you'll know exactly where this is going. So at the time, the Mediterranean fleet had a small but noticeable advantage over the Regia Marina, specifically because much of the Regia Marina's latest and greatest and newest vessels, including the Littorios, were still under construction. So the Italian Navy was left with relatively few modern vessels, and even as far as their battleships went, several of their older battleships were in the process of being retrofitted. So there wasn't actually a huge amount of modern Italian shipping, or Italian shipping generally, in the Regia Marina compared to what there would be in 1939-1940. Now, admittedly, obviously, the modernisations to some of the Royal Navy ships hadn't happened yet either, but there were considerably more of them. Their refits and upgrades, such as they were, had been keeping significantly more up to date. And when things started looking like they were going to get bad, the Royal Navy started calling in ships from all over. So Admiral Cunningham describes the fact, one morning he'd wake up and there'd be a destroyer flotilla that hadn't been there the night before. The next day a few cruisers showed up, then a battleship showed up, then a battle cruiser, then another squadron of light cruisers, and all sorts, the odd aircraft carrier just popping up. So by the time it looked to be the pinnacle of tension, and obviously we know historically the tension then wound down, the Royal Navy had a force sitting in the Mediterranean that was of considerably greater numbers and firepower as compared to the Italian fleet. So a naval war, had it broken out at that stage, would have consisted either of a very, very quick and rather painful defeat for Italy if they'd chosen to have a significant force at sea at the time, or they would have had to hold up in Taranto and other ports, because if they come out, there's no chance really for them to do any real damage. And we're slightly before the era when air power is in a position to do any significant damage to a moving fleet at sea, at which point it would degenerate into the British trying to lure the Italians out, probably using Taranto-style air carrier strikes, such as they would be, and the Italians trying to whittle down the Royal Navy with relatively ineffectual airstrikes and potentially slightly more effective submarine strikes. Suspicious asks, Vanguard was completed using modified 15-inch 42 turrets. Could the same have been done to Lion instead using Nelson and Rodney's 16-inch 45 turrets? If so, how do you think they would have been used? I mean, theoretically, yes. It's, two sets of 3 tripled 16-inch turrets, but practically no, because the timing just doesn't work out. I mean, assuming that there wasn't a war, the Nelsons were still the most powerful capital ships in the Royal Navy at the point that the Lion class were going to be laid down in 1939, because the King George V hadn't yet come into service. And you can make arguments over which of the two is more powerful anyway, but regardless anyway. If you're going to use the triple 16-inch, then you are going off of the Nelsons, that is, in the Lions. The projected completion date for the Lions is late 1942. If you look at the time it took to refit, rework, etc., the 15-inch turrets for Vanguard, and then you realise that by the time that we're talking about, Nelson and Rodney's turrets have all sorts of weird and wonderful, interesting retrofits done to them to make them nowhere near as bad as they were when they launched, you are going to need, assuming that the ship is, Lions, this is due for completion in late 42, that means the turret installations have to be done at the latest. You probably want to be doing those at the beginning of 42, at least late 41. And that means with about a year or more's worth of modification and retrofitting work, that means the turrets are going to have to be available to the armourers at the very beginning of 1941 - the end of 1940, which in turn means you're going to have to take Nelson and Rodney out of commission at some point in early 1940, which is around about the time the very first King George V is going to be coming into service. And considering that at that time the Royal Navy is thinking war might break out in 41, 42 or 43, you're talking about a considerable period of time which the Royal Navy has highlighted as a danger area where war might break out, where you will be down two of the most powerful combat ships that the Royal Navy possesses, with nothing to show for it in terms of increased power. And the Royal Navy, bear in mind, is not necessarily entirely happy with the 16-inch guns on the Nelsons anyway. So once you get into the actual outbreak of World War II, it becomes even less plausible, because you need ships that are actually active on the front lines, and the construction dates or the finish dates for Lion and Temeraire keep getting put back and put back and put back and put back until they're eventually cancelled. At no point is their estimated completion date late enough that you could plausibly actually go for this. I mean, towards the end of the war, fair enough, Rodney is pretty much up on the stocks, so you could make an argument that maybe if the Lion class had a design restart, maybe with a 1942 design, looking to complete in 45-46, then maybe they could have taken the turrets off of Rodney for that, for at least one of the ships, but they never actually went for that. So, I mean, it would be a bit pointless to start with. So, yeah, theoretically, yes, you could do it, but in all practical purposes, no. And if they had somehow done so, it's very difficult to predict how they would have been used, because the gap in capability, the 2-year gap where you don't have Nelson and Rodney, that could massively change the situation at sea. Burnt Potato asks, I was rewatching your 5-minute guide to Yamato, and I had a realization. When you mentioned the Japanese strategy of leapfrogging generations of battleships to preempt the response classes, given that Yamato was already pushing the limits of practical design, much less Japanese industry, what were the preparations for the next class? Or was it simply a case similar to the French of drawing up ships that wouldn't actually fit in their shipyards? Well, one thing you've got to remember is that when the Japanese laid down Yamato, Musashi, Shinano, and the unnamed other vessels, they actually had already paid to expand the shipyard facilities to cope with them, because there weren't shipyard facilities in their chosen dockyards that could handle the Yamato class already. So that would have been sorted. The follow-on, the A150s, as you can see here, although we don't know all that much about their design, from what we've been able to gather, they seem to have used roughly the same hull, at least in terms of overall scale, but with somewhat heavier armour and twin 20-inch instead of triple 18.1. So fitting the A150s into docks that had been specifically expanded to comfortably cope with something the size of a Yamato, that's entirely possible to do. It'd be insanely expensive, but it could be done. And as I pointed out in one or two of the main videos, Yamato is actually shorter than Iowa. It's wider and more heavily armed and armoured, hence the increased displacement, but it is not, in fact, longer. So it would be possible for Japan to continue building very large capital ships using their expanded yards for at least a couple more classes, and probably even then expand those yards further if they absolutely had to. But then they'd really start to be pushing it. And to be honest, even with the A150s, they had looked at larger ships. They'd looked at a 30-knot version, but that had come out as like 90,000+ tons, at which point they decided against building them, not on the grounds of they couldn't get them into the yards, but on the grounds that they were too expensive. So, yeah. I mean, if you imagine taking a Yamato class hull and scaling it up just via simple expansion until it's the same length as an Iowa, that ship's going to displace a colossal amount. Next up, I know breeches buoys were used as life-saving equipment on the Great Lakes. Were they used to save people on the ocean? They were certainly used on coastal stations, Coast Guard, Royal, RNLI, etc., all over the place. So that's technically at the seas or on the oceans, at least as long as one of the points is on land and the ship in distress has presumably got aground just out to sea. As far as out in the deep ocean, not so much, largely on the grounds that in order for the line to remain in tension, the ships have to maintain a regular distance apart, which in the event that a ship is sinking out in the open sea is not usually going to be something that you can guarantee, especially in very rough seas. There are obviously similar tension lines that can be used for transporting people across in more peaceful times when ships aren't sinking, but that's when both ships are under control and can regulate the distance between them. Plus, you've got to worry about if we're talking about two large ships, if one is going down that close to the other one, then there's all sorts of possibilities, including possibly the sinking ship capsizing or rolling over onto the nearby vessel or dragging it down with them, and all sorts of fun shenanigans going on. There are occasional times when a ship that's in distress and very slowly sinking or is crippled, i.e. effectively basically stationary, has transferred some people off of the ship using a similar system to the breeches buoy system. But that's because, as I said, the situation is more akin to two vessels being alongside each other for normal transfer rather than specifically kind of an active, violent storm sinking ship rescue situation. But yeah, it's used on occasion in the deep ocean, but in the deep ocean you're more likely looking at scramble nets, divers' ropes, and deployed rafts and lifeboats. Robert Knapp asks, which, if any, ships in the high seas fleet of each category, battleship, battlecruiser, light cruisers, etc., would have been worth or even possible to modernise for the Second World War if they'd survived into the 1930s, or are none of them worth a full QE or Cavour style rebuild? So you can pretty much rule out the small stuff. The destroyer's just not worth keeping around. German destroyers / torpedo boats tended towards the smaller side anyway, so forget those. Likewise, armoured cruisers, forget them, they're not really practical. That basically leaves you in the realm of small cruisers, battle cruisers, and battleships. In terms of the small cruisers, it's kind of either a no or a maybe. For a lot of classes. So if you want to look at what would be a practical frontline light cruiser, again, forget it, it's not worth it. But if you want to look at, say, something like the C class in the Royal Navy, some of which were being converted to anti-aircraft cruisers, well, a whole raft of at least like the last half dozen German light cruiser classes of World War One, going from the Colons backwards, all of them are roughly in the shouting distance, plus minus, of C and D class cruiser displacement, at which point you could refit them as second line anti-aircraft cruisers, I guess. In terms of the battleships and battle cruisers, I wouldn't keep any of the 12-inch ships personally. I mean, theoretically, yeah, you could take a Koenig and do a Cavour style refit, but even the Cavours were not really considered absolute front line. Baden and Bayern, however, they're roughly analogous to a QE or R-class. You could run them through a QE modernisation style upgrade and have a relatively decent capital ship floating around. You'd have to put a little bit more emphasis into the machinery spaces to get them up to half decent speed, but it could be done, especially if, again, you spent a more Cavour style money and did some proper hull modifications as well. Battle cruisers, I think it's kind of a coin toss. If you go by battle cruisers that are actually completed, i.e. Derflinger and Hindenburg, you could make relatively decent extremely large cruiser killers out of them, I think, by basically just updating their systems, updating their turrets, and massively updating their machinery. But if you want an actual viable capital ship out of them, then you'd have to stretch to completing the Mackensons. And if you complete the Mackensons, if you look at their overall layout, speed, firepower, armor, etc., they're kind of just like better Congos. They've got the same, roughly similar baseline speed. They've got roughly similar baseline armament, but they actually have armor that has some meaning to it. At which point, again, a 1930s refit, you don't really need to change the armament, apart from maybe increased elevation on the guns. You obviously would redo the secondary batteries, redo the machinery. You could easily push them up past 30 knots. The armour's pretty okay for a battle cruiser, at which point you just have a relatively decent fast battle cruiser. In fact, you'd probably have one of a fully refitted Mackensen would probably be up there with Renown and Hood as the most powerful battle cruiser holdovers. It'd certainly have a significant advantage over a Pulse and a significant advantage over all of the Congos because, well, similar firepower, similar speed, but actual protection, Hamilcar Barker asks, while reviewing the results of a recent Dogger Bank refight at my club, it struck me that the High Seas Fleet was in essence using the Kantai Kessen doctrine in their attempts to bite off small portions of the Grand Fleet. If successful, they envisaged a decisive battle to gain parity, if not superiority. Did the Japanese Navy take inspiration? Not really, because the doctrines are actually slightly different. So, the German doctrine, as far as trying to bring the Royal Navy to battle, was to lure out a small portion of the Royal Navy, whether that be the battle cruiser fleet or a battle cruiser fleet and a single battle squadron or a single battle squadron or whatever, then use pretty much the strength of the entire High Seas Fleet to destroy it, and ideally repeat this process a couple of times until the Royal Navy is at something approximating numerical parity, then separately commit to a major fleet action. Whereas the Japanese battle doctrine envisaged the US Navy sailing in a strength that was considerably greater than their own, and then using non-capital shipcraft, destroyers, cruisers, and then later aircraft carriers, to whittle down the opposing fleet whilst it's undertaking a singular journey, at the end of which then the Japanese battle fleet takes on the reduced US battle line. So it's both in terms of what's supposed to be whittling down the enemy fleet and what the sequences are, they are rather different doctrines, even if the overall objective of meeting the enemy with your battle fleet, with your enemy's fleet significantly reduced in numbers, that's the similarity, I guess. So you can guess from that. And the Japanese aren't particularly inspired by the High Seas Fleet's efforts, apart from anything they've watched the High Seas Fleet's efforts fail. Kantai Kessen is, as I mentioned when I did my video on Kantai Kessen, is basically an interpretation, or at least the Japanese idea of what an interpretation of what they think Mahanian battle doctrine is. They're looking for the one decisive battle, two fleets heading towards each other, and basically what they're trying to do is play the Uno reverse card on the US Navy, where they think, okay, well, the US Navy will clearly sail for a Mahanian decisive battle because it has the superior numbers and should be able to theoretically win the war by clearing us off the seas, but we have the special tactic up our sleeves that's going to flip things round on them so that by the time the Mahanian battle actually occurs, which we will accept, we'll have changed the odds so they're now in our favour instead, as opposed to the High Seas Fleet, which is a little bit more almost 18th century maraudery when it comes to its strategy for whittling down the enemy fleets. Although the idea of having a very large fleet and the idea of a single decisive battle supposedly being the end of it all is, to a certain extent, again, a misunderstanding of Mahanian doctrine as seen through a German lens, as opposed to Kantai Kessen being a misunderstanding of Mahanian doctrine seen through a Japanese lens. It's interesting, actually, that the ones who embrace the Mahanian doctrine the most seem to also have the most problems actually interpreting what Mahan was going on about. Cisco Fan asks, why did the US prioritise the Essex swarm and not an Iowa-Montana swarm, even before Pearl Harbor, considering carriers were not yet seen as frontline weapon systems? Why were the Iowas as carrier escorts built first instead of the more powerful Montanas? There's a whole mix of factors. Partly attitudes towards carriers were shifting slightly, but more of it was the US had a lot of battleships. Admittedly, a bunch of them were old, but they did still have quite a few of them. And at the time that they authorised the Essexes to go ahead, they also had a fair number of fast battleships under construction. Comparatively, their carrier fleet was small. You had 2 Lexingtons, you had Ranger if you wanted to count it, and you had Enterprise and Yorktown, with Wasp and Hornet in various stages of being complete or under construction. So you had far, far fewer carriers, and one thing they had learned during the fleet problems, amongst others, was that carriers were very squishy. So if you're starting off with a lot fewer carriers and a lot less under construction compared to your battleships, and you know the things you have less of are more squishy, you're going to need a lot more of them to replace the ones that are inevitably going to get blown up in any kind of prolonged war, hence Essexes. Also, Essexes are smaller vessels in terms of displacement and equipment requirements as compared to an Iowa, so you can build more for the same money. And the Iowas are not just carrier escorts. They're also hunting down the Congos. They're also general line of battle vessels. They are considerably more than just very, very large carrier escorts, although that is a useful role for them. So that's kind of addressing the first half. Why are they building a lot more Essexes? Basically because they think they're going to need them. They're not anticipating losing battleships at the same rate they're anticipating losing carriers. But the other element as to why the Iowas first and then the Montanas, simply put, the Iowas are the US Escalator Clause Treaty battleships. You can't build a Montana on the Escalator Clause. So you have the North Carolinas and the South Dakotas, which is we're sticking to the treaty displacement. You have the Iowas, which are we can now go up to 45,000 tons, so this is what we can do with 45,000 tons, and then you have the Montanas, which are, forget the treaties, we're just building a big ship. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, there are, among other things, two things I don't quite understand about the Deutschlands. In addition to your point that they basically ignore the existence of Hood, Renown and Repulse, I've never understood the oft-repeated mantra that there are only 3 Allied ships in the world that could catch and kill them. There are many 8-inch guns that would make quick work of a 3.1-inch belt at most battle ranges, and given a heavy cruiser's ability to dictate range and rate of fire, I'd bet good money on 2 counties or a county in Algerie against Lutzow. Indeed, while I understand they were at knife fighting range, Hiei's 8-inch belt wasn't exactly indifferent to cruiser gunfire either. Second, wouldn't a 10 or even a 9.2-inch main armament have made more sense? It would have had a higher rate of fire, whilst at the same time saving weight, and just as easily penetrate the belt of any cruiser. The armour and the firepower things are kind of tied together, because, for better or worse, the Deutschlands were trying to keep to the Versailles Treaty limits, and that meant you couldn't go all out in all directions in terms of speed, protection and firepower. So if you accepted the fact that you might end up meeting a heavy cruiser in battle, well, the belt on the Deutschlands was enough to provide a degree of protection against 6-inch gunfire. Now, as Exeter proved, and as you pointed out, against heavy cruiser gunfire, perhaps not so much, but that's part of the reason why you go for the 11-inch gun, because the 11-inch gun can range out further than the 8-inch, and in theory should provide more accurate fire at that kind of range, and will deliver the single biggest blow per shell landed. So if the heavy cruiser decides to fight it out at long distances, in theory your 11-inch guns should find it easier to hit than their 8-inch guns should, and when they do hit, you hopefully will be crippling your opponent very quickly. So maximising the firepower. And as a result, at long ranges, your 3.1-inch or however thick belt, bearing in mind all sorts of things changed between Lutzow, Scheer and Graf Spee, but in any case, your armour belt should be able to keep up 8-inch at that range, and if the cruiser decides to close the range down, which, as you said, it could in theory do with its speed advantage, it would be just making the 11-inch knockout blow much, much easier. So then you come on to the firepower, and this is kind of the thing. If you can't afford to have a particularly heavily protected vessel, and even if you downrate to 9.2 or 10-inch guns, you're not saving that much weight, so you're not going to improve the armour all that much, then you want your guns to be able to hit as hard as possible. And given that the biggest gun that you're allowed to have is already the 11-inch, then you might as well use that, because heavy cruiser, 10,000-ton heavy cruiser that's hit by a 9.2-inch shell, it'll hurt. It might not stop it. I mean, as extra proof, not even an 11-inch shell will necessarily stop one, but it will do a lot more damage to one than a 9.2 or even a 10-inch. And as I've covered before, once you get to 10-inch, you've pretty much got the same rate of fire as an 11-inch, but just you hit slightly weaker. Plus, there's also the prestige thing of the ships that they're replacing have 11-inch guns, so we might as well keep those around. And with the 11-inch, you can build, and indeed they did, build off of pre-existing designs, whereas with a 10 or a 9.2, you're going to have to be, if you're the Germans, working from a completely new sheet, because the guns that are smaller caliber than that immediately further down are either your 8.3-inch or your 9.4-inch, both of which are very old hat designs by the time the Panzerschiff are being built. Lord Nelson asks, how would you rate the design of the Spanish Los Meregildos First-Rates versus their British and French contemporaries? So the Los Meregildos are also known as the Santa Ana class, so you might recognise some of those names. Príncipe de Asturias, Santa Ana herself, Real Carlos, Salvador del Mundo. There's a whole load of them, which the Spanish build to the same designs. They're 112-gunner, 3-deck first-rate ships of the line. And broadly speaking, they are pretty decent vessels. In terms of size and overall armament, they sit pretty much right between the British and Spanish ships. So the British first-rates built at this kind of time period, so Royal George, Queen Charlotte, and Royal Sovereign, are 100-gunners. The Spanish ships 112 gunners, and then you have the Oceans, which are, of course, 120 gunners. So on paper, the French ship is superior, and the British ship is inferior in terms of firepower, but they are close enough together in capabilities that you have to start looking at the finer details. So, for example, Royal Sovereign is a very fast ship, helped by the fact that it also carries copper on its hull, which the Spanish and French ships don't for the majority of the Napoleonic Wars. The British ships, being slightly shorter, are slightly more agile, but obviously carry slightly less firepower. As a result, as was kind of already mentioned, the Spanish ships certainly seem to have the vote of confidence of the Royal Navy, as the ones that were captured by the Royal Navy do tend to be kept in service by the Royal Navy. So, there's nothing particularly wrong with them from that perspective. And they're reputed to be very good gunnery ships, i.e. they're fairly steady, their gun ports are relatively high out of the water, so overall they're a good, solid, above average first-rate ship design. The main problem with them is that they're built for a navy that really doesn't have a lot of money or a lot of training, and so they're not able to be utilised in the manner that you would otherwise think. For example, Salvador del Mundo is captured at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent by, in large part, HMS Victory, despite the fact that on paper Salvador del Mundo has a slight advantage over Victory, but after being somewhat shot up by various smaller passing British ships, Victory just drops in on the stern of Salvador del Mundo and is about to effectively do several years earlier what she would later do to Bucentaur, and Salvador del Mundo just surrenders. So a lot of what you might be able to determine from their performance is largely down to their crews and those crews' experience rather than anything else. So I would say, as an engineering accomplishment, you could rate, I think, the Spanish first rates of this class at maybe a 7.5 to an 8 out of 10. But the differences between them, the British and the French, are small enough that once you take into account crew quality, they can be either the top of the line or bottom of the line, depending on whose crew you stick on them. Lincoln Locker asks, I've just watched the Armoured Carriers video about HMAS Shropshire, and during the Battle of Surigao Strait, around 40 minutes and 30 seconds into the video, Mr. Davis is describing receiving incoming fire from Yamashiro during the engagement. He states that the 14-inch shells Yamashiro fired at them were glowing due to friction. Is this something that was commonly reported about large caliber shells during night actions? Yes, there's a reason that most long exposure shots taken during night actions tend to look something like this, so you can see the path of the shells going through the air. I mean, you're taking a lump of metal, you're putting anything from several dozen to several hundred pounds of explosive behind it and then blowing it out of a gun. That's going to heat the shell up quite a bit, air friction completely aside, and so you will end up with glowing shells travelling through the sky when it's dark enough to see the glow. There's numerous accounts that support this. In Surigao Strait, the various night actions of Guadalcanal, and more particularly one of the ones I was always stuck in my mind, actually, when it comes to this kind of thing, is actually at Guadalcanal during the opening stages of what will eventually become Washington's beatdown of Hiroshima, but before Hiroshima's shown up. There's a particular account that you can find in Jim Hornfisher's book that covers that particular action, where you see the perspective is from Washington, and it fires its main guns, and the sailors who can actually see these glowing points of light rise up into the cloud layer, briefly disappear. The clouds light up very briefly, then they disappear, and then a few seconds later, further down range, they see these glowing dots fall back out of the clouds at the far end of the shell's arc, and then hit things. So yeah, the large caliber shells fired from battleships in night actions you can visually spot and trace as they fly through the sky. Mark Rice asks, was any effort made to speed the loading of big naval guns using methods analogous to those used on small arms, such as, for example, a revolver? Surely there would be enough room to have used a revolver-like mechanism on a big gun, and it could have been designed in a way that provided substantial flash protection? Not for the big guns, no. If you go into a battleship turret, you'd be surprised there is actually very little space, considering how large the turret is. And whatever space you have to have, that's got to be for all angles that you're going to be on. So if you're going to have, let's say, a 6-shooter style revolver mechanism, that means, let's say for ease of argument, that it's going to load at the lowest of the cylinders. So you're going to have to raise the roof of the turret to accommodate the extra height of this revolving cylinder. You're not going to have to deepen the gun pit, fortunately, which would be a lot more difficult, but you are going to have to substantially widen it, and therefore the guns are going to have to sit wider apart as well, which means your barbette's going to be larger. You've now also put substantially more weight on the gun, which is going to affect its balance point and the overall weight of the turret. The mechanism obviously is vulnerable to damage and or failure, which is going to make things a lot more difficult to keep the gun operational. You've also got to account for the fact you've got tens of thousands of pounds of weight once you add in like 6 shells and all of their charges and the actual revolver mechanism itself, which is going to be changing radically as you load and fire this thing. So that's going to make the gun balance even more of a difficult proposition. And ultimately, if you're going to have a system where your rammers can ram these things home into the breeches of the gun itself relatively swiftly and easily, you're not really going to be able to have much in the way of substantial flash protection unless you introduce, I don't know, something like automatic spring-loaded plates at either end, which is just a whole other level of extra mechanical issue, which could break and go wrong. So basically, it would increase the weight, the balance issues, the size of the turrets, and still render them fairly vulnerable to exploding or just being crippled by an impact. So it's just not worth it, unfortunately. Blacksmith Panzer asks, how did the US Navy work with and take advantage of the Superfortress bombing campaign over Japan? For instance, did they ever send in strike groups during Superfortress raids to overwhelm and confuse Japanese air defences? I know part of the reason the Marines stormed Iwo Jima was so it could serve as a base for Mustangs to escort the B-29s, but did the Navy ever deploy carrier fighters to escort the bombers before this? And did the Navy ever try large-scale bombing sorties in emulation of the US Army Air Force? Not particularly. A good chunk of the B-29 raids were done at night, and the US Navy, although it had night fighters, didn't really conduct massive strike operations at night. Even the daylight bombing raids, the sort of high-altitude ones, they weren't really coordinated with the US Navy because the defences that were used against the two types of airstrikes are basically entirely different. The US Navy had no particular desire or indeed capability to conduct large-scale bombing against cities. They were much more interested about going after point targets like ships, maybe the occasional factory or port installation, things like that. And as a result, the high-altitude anti-aircraft fire and high-altitude fighters that the Japanese deployed against the B-29s wouldn't have been used against fairly low-flying Avengers and Helldivers and Hellcats and Corsairs and so forth. So even if there was a combined strike, the actual resources put against the two different formations in two different areas at two different altitudes wouldn't really have resulted in a drain from one over to the other, particularly. And since the Navy lacked B-29 style bombers in any significant numbers, there was no point for the Navy trying to get in on the raids themselves. And that's it for this week. Thank you very much everyone for listening, and if indeed you still are, and I hope to see you all again in another video at some point soon. Bye.